Okay, we're back for round two of this NOL illustration. Again, the facts were the federal return had a loss in year one, income the next year. The federal allows this to be netted. And in our first state illustration, we're going to say it's a state that starts off with the following law. The state law says start with the federal income, and we do. Apply the apportionment factor, and we do. And the apportionment factor, because we're talking about year two, happens to be this amount. We talked last time on why it changes from year to year, or how it can change from year to year. It doesn't have to, but in this example, it went up to 45%. So therefore, the apportionment factor in year one, or rather in year two of this state, this is state A, we're going to call it, is at 45%. And that means of the 100,000, 45% is subject to the state tax, and that becomes the taxable income, 45,000. There is no adjustment for the NOL in this particular state because the state follows the federal law all the way through, 100%, but in particular and specifically with the NOL in this case. Could have different laws for other things, but in this state there is no modification of the NOL. Stays strictly with the federal taxable income. Okay, now that leaves us to state two, or a different tax law if the state did it differently. And let's see what happens now. Now, this state says we'll start with the income from the federal return before applying the net operating loss carry forward. So this was the the federal taxable income before applying the net operating loss. And so the state starts with that number here. This is the state's particular law. Again, this is just variations in laws between states. And then the state says, apply the apportionment factor to that, which is 45%. And that becomes taxable in the state. Then go to the net operating loss on the federal return and apply the apportionment factor that existed in the year that the NOL was created, which is probably a more fair way to look at things. So it goes back to this year. The apportionment factor was only 30%, and thus the NOL allowed in the state, this is the federal income tax carry forward applied at the application rate, the apportionment rate under this state, and as you can see, it is only 60,000 because it's going back and using the apportionment factor found here, the year that the operating loss occurred. And the result is that now the taxable income at the state level, after adjusting for the federal net operating loss carry forward, is 75, which is in contradistinction in comparison to what happened here, where there was no adjustment, no modification of the application of the net operating loss. And you can see that you can get wide differences in state taxable income depending on how the state applies this particular modification to the federal taxable income. That was the whole idea of showing you this, to illustrate that even though the apportionment factor that we learned about is designed to allow that the net income that's derived by the company is fairly apportioned amongst the various states so that there's little or no double taxation. That's the idea. It's not necessarily that simple because of the modifications that can happen from state to state. I'll give you one more example just to drive home the point, but I'd like you to be able to calculate questions like this because I'll give you some. But to drive home the point about the fact that there can be these wide differences, here's one more, which we'll just do right here. And that is, you can have two states. We'll do Maryland, and we'll do other, because I'm not going to pick any particular state. I'm just going to use it as a pretend example here. But Maryland, for example, starts with the federal taxable income, whatever it might be, but then does not allow for Section 179 deductions, which is first year depreciation. So it's going to add those back. It'll add those back and come up to a modified taxable income for state purposes and tax that number. It'll apply the apportionment factor here to get the ultimate taxable income at the state level. And that could compare to another state where it starts with the federal taxable income, the same, but then allows for the Section 179, so it doesn't add it back. So its taxable income could be a lot lower, could be a lot smaller, since it allows for the deduction at the federal level, and therefore the apportionment factor, which is applied here, winds up with a smaller state taxable income in that state. So here, Maryland's going to tax more of the federal taxable income because they're doing an add back, yet this state over here is taxing a smaller amount, and the windup is you might not be taxing just between the two states 100% of the taxable income at the federal level. You might wind up taxing 110% because Maryland doesn't allow for this deduction. Again, the illustration here is not something I'm going to hold you to, like I would like you to be able to calculate net operating loss differences between state tax laws if I give you an illustration to do, an example to do. But I just want you to really, really understand how the concept of the apportionment is, in theory, a great one, but when there's these modifications to the federal taxable income, it can mess it up. That's the whole point. All right, so we'll stop here, and we'll have a summary coming up later in some subsequent videos.